Ladies and gentlemen, welcome here today. I'm delighted to be here with my fellow speakers. My name is Patrick McGurn. Up to recently, I was the project manager of the Aran Life project, which you've heard about from the conference. I'm now starting as the project manager with Keevno Aran, which is an EIP project looking at the management of habitats on the Aran Islands. But I'm here to, just a few things. First of all, the talks that were missed this morning will be later on before the plenary this afternoon. We have a live question thing under the Slido, if you want to join it, to put any questions on. And we also have a poll there for answers, and we'll try to maybe discuss what comes up. If you like a particular question, you like it, and then the ones that's more popular, the questions will be... We'll try to answer some of them then, you know, and again keep them accurate, keep them relevant to the subject, you know. So our talk today is planning for the future and how can we improve biodiversity on farmland. As a Fermanagh man, I just stood on the Fermanagh border and looked across at Leitrim and looked at a landscape and said, "Wow, you know, that's a beautiful landscape." And let's not be too negative. There are beautiful landscapes all around Ireland. I'll take the Aran Islands because I work there. I'll take Fermanagh because I live there. Leitrim because my mother's from there, and I just think it's a beautiful landscape. Unfortunately, maybe we're slowly planting it up, but that's a different story altogether. But it's important that these beautiful landscapes, farmed landscapes, do exist around Ireland. Now, I have worked with farmers for the last 30 years, and for about 10 years, I worked as an intensive agricultural advisor. And after that, I sort of took an interest in wildflowers, and I retrained as an ecologist. So for the last 20 years, I've worked in the ecology end of agriculture, still with farmers. But I always think, I sort of feel I have a foot in both cases, because the old agricultural leanings come out and the ecologist leanings come out of me. And one thing, I saw this diagram once, and I thought, that is maybe something that people see things from different perspectives. And farmers and conservationists, there's different perspectives there. And Andy touched on this yesterday, that nobody's necessarily wrong or right. We're sitting here at a conference talking how do we improve biodiversity on farmland. We all feel it's very important. But maybe if you look at some of what the agricultural organisations are talking to the farming community, you'll read this talk about we need a 70% increase in food production before the end of the century. Do you know, we're talking about a sustainable intensification, do you know? So just because we feel that this is vital and people are going to grasp that, everybody has different perspectives on it, and it's important to recognise that. Now, the agriculturist in me looks at that and says, geez, I'd love that. I'd love to be farming that. 100% pure perennial ryegrass. Cattle love it, it grows well, high yields, maybe through a few more hedges in it, a few more hedgerow trees in it, add to the biodiversity a wee bit, you know. The environmentalist in me thinks, there's nothing there, you know. But from a farming point of view, it's really good. Grazing animals love it. Even the whooper swans, when they come in from Iceland, they go for it, you know, because it's nice and sweet. Then I go to this, and I go, the environmentalist in me, isn't that absolutely fantastic? That's brilliant. Where the agriculturist in me goes, yeah, he gets maybe one cut a year out of it, you know, grazing of it, yields very low, very hard. It hardly justifies the payments. Department of Agriculture don't particularly like it because there's bits of scrub all around it. The farmer doesn't like it because that scrub's not eligible, where that one there, it's 100% eligible, no queries asked, you know. And yet, from a biodiversity point of view, that is amazing. But we don't have those two extremes in Ireland. What we basically have is creeping intensification. And what I mean by creeping intensification is a lot of those wildflower meadows have gone. They haven't been reseeded. Ireland only reseeds about less than 2% of its agricultural area every year, farmland area, which is quite low when you take that the 50%, when it's less than 50% perennial ryegrass, the advice is sort of to do it. But we ended up where the more interesting places from a biodiversity point of view, but less from an agriculture point, has been planted with conifers, with vast range of this grasslands that are not intensive, they're sort of low input grasslands, but they're not overly rich in biodiversity, you know. And that is all this creeping intensification that as I've seen throughout my 30-year career working with farmers, you know. And something used to annoy me as a young advisor, you know, or a young fellow going out to talk about a hedge when you see the whole field, beautiful species, but grassland was disappearing, but there was more concern for the hedge. So then how do we address these with three very different farming systems? Do we have sort of bland, agri-environment schemes that sort of suit them all? And the three of them are totally different. Do we say the intensive sector is going to get more intensive? Do you know how? What's the output? What's the advantage of? Do we just try to accept that it's intensive? Do we try to save what's left of these? We have agri-environment schemes that have a low input permanent pasture, do you know, that allow 40 kilograms of nitrogen on them. The science tells us once you put 40 kilograms of nitrogen, the wildflowers go, and that's our agri-environment scheme. So we have absolutely no protection for the semi-natural grasslands unless they're designated. And this creeping intensification is going on, and the reason that we are losing so much of our grasslands, and possibly we get more concerned about our mountains than our grasslands disappearing. So it brings us on to our speakers. We have Patricia Deane, who's with an EIP in the Reeks, Elaine McGoff, who's with Taisce, Alan Lauder from the Curlew project, Barney McKay, who's a farmer, to give their views of how do we improve biodiversity on farmland. So I'll hand you over to Patricia now.
Hello everybody, it's great to see such interest in a full house. So I'm going to try and engage with you a little bit, guys, because we've been talking about engagement, okay? So I'm going to be asking you a few little questions, asking for some show of hands maybe. Are you happy enough for that? Yeah. I got a few yes. I don't know what's wrong with the rest of you. Are you tired after all the talking, guys? Okay, lots to take in. So, sorry now for destroying the beautiful photograph. How many of you have been down to the MacGillycuddy Reeks? How many of you are familiar with it? Not too bad. A few more of you so we'll get down in the next couple of years, hopefully. So what are we doing in the MacGillycuddy Reeks? We have an environmental scheme, as Patrick said. It's an agri-environmental scheme. It's a sustainable agricultural plan for the MacGillycuddy Reeks using a collective farm management approach. The EIP project for the MacGillycuddy Reeks is European Innovation Partnership. It's funded by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine under the RDP programme 2014 to 2020. And without that funding, we probably wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be here today to talk to you, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of context about how we came to developing our EIP in the MacGillycuddy Reeks, because I think it's important. So it's going to be a little short story, very short in time, so I won't make it long, okay? So how did we come to be in the MacGillycuddy Reeks? Well, what we had to do was we had to bring everybody together. Everybody who had an interest in the MacGillycuddy Reeks. So who's missing from that list, guys? We have an independent chairman, very hard person to get, to try and bring all the interest groups together. Local development company. So I worked for South Kerry Development Partnership, which is a local development company. And we worked kind of well, I suppose, bringing this together because we were independent. We didn't have any particular vested interest, should I call it, okay? And we all came together with the community representatives, the small and medium enterprise businesses, the recreational users, because obviously Carnthool is Ireland's highest mountain, and it is on the bucket list for a lot of people wanting to get up there, climb the mountain, see it. So it was very important to bring the recreational users on board. Commercial users. I don't know if anyone can appreciate approximately 125,000 people and growing year on year going through this landscape, okay? It's all designated land, it's special area conservation. So the numbers are growing every year. Huge tourism interest, and that's obviously a big consequence to the landscape itself as well as the landowners. Failte Ireland, obviously because of tourism, National Parks and Wildlife because of the designation, the Department of Rural and Community Development. So that's how we came to get the project initially, because they asked us to look at permissive access to Ireland's highest mountain to see could it be done on a permissive access basis. Okay? Kerry County Council is the local authority and a local authority elected representative. But guys, one question for you now, who's missing from that list? Exactly. So we brought all the landowners on. We had little local elections to elect landowners, okay? Because without the landowners, we can do nothing. So the question I'm being asked today is, how can we improve biodiversity on farmland? You have to engage with the landowners. You can have every bit of policy, you can have every bit of research, but without engaging with the landowners, you cannot improve biodiversity. Is that fair enough? Everyone agree with that? I think we're in trouble if we don't see that, guys. I think that's really important, and I'm quite passionate about it because I work very closely with the landowners. And to give you another bit of context, I come from a farming background myself. My father's 71 years of age shortly. He's a sheep farmer, a small sheep farmer on the Slieve Mountains. So I have a really good, strong understanding of what it's like on these farmlands, okay? So it's interesting because for the last while now, we were just in the initial stages of setting up our project. We had huge interest from all of the landowners. We were inundated with expressions of interest for our scheme, which was absolutely hugely positive. And we gave a commitment to all of those landowners that we would go out and walk the land to see do they have the targets for the scheme. So we have a 2-tier programme for our EIP project. It's going to be looking at actions-based, and we're also looking at results-based, okay? To deal with the issues on the ground as identified by the landowners, because it's locally led, it's from the bottom up, and the landowners know their land and they want a bit of advice and assistance. So we've met just short of about 80 landowners. We've walked, I think it was just short of 60 individual farms. Now we're looking at the commonages, and commonages, as we all know, are quite challenging. Because what's the problem with commonages, guys? It's a bit of a, well, I won't call it a problem, but it's a bit of a challenge, I suppose. Commonages aren't fenced. And when you're trying to manage a landscape and you're trying to keep livestock in an area, it's very hard to do that when the livestock can go wherever they want. So that is a little bit of a challenge for us, okay? But out of all the landowners we've met, so up on nearly 80 or 90 landowners at this stage, how many landowners do you think knew why the land was designated? Here's the starkness of it now, guys. None. Okay? So we had one landowner who came kind of close. He said, I have an area, blanket bog down there. And I went, come on, what are you doing with the blanket bog? Yeah, can't do anything with it, Trish. It's not worth much to me. Okay? So we do need to look at the landscape as well. I don't think devising schemes that are the same across the board can work. The landscape is very different. And the people that you have put your hands up when you've been down to the MacGillycuddy Reeks, you know what it's like. You know the landscape. You've seen the scree slopes. It's really hard to try and manage and farm that land. Okay, so where do we go from? Well, we do need to consider these things, and this is what I always try and go to consider, consult and communicate. We do need to consider all the factors at play. We do need to consult with everybody. We can't just consult with certain people. We need to bring everybody around the table. So probably the other people that are missing from our little local group there, the MacGillycuddy Reeks Forum, are probably the Department of Agriculture, because there is huge overlap. It's not just designated land, it is also agricultural land, okay? Now, it's probably not the most highly productive farmland, because yesterday there was a lot said about food production, and I could feel myself getting a little bit hot under the collar going, how much food production do we actually expect from this landscape? You know, there's sheep farmers there, guys, but they're not viable. And if the sheep farmers aren't viable for what they're producing, and we can't be mistaken, they are producing public service and goods. We talk about ecosystem services. They are giving us water quality. They're giving us the carbon sequestration. We all know this. I don't need to preach to the converted here in the room. But do we put a value on that? So do we value the biodiversity? Is it viable? And that's why I have a picture of that young guy there. I think he was only 7 years of age there, climbing the MacGillycuddy Reeks for his first time. If we don't engage with young people, and if they don't see a future in farming, then I think we're also in trouble. Okay, I hope I'm not too depressing now and stark. But we do need the support, because if we don't understand, if the guys that are on the ground farming the land don't understand the biodiversity, well, where do we go? What is the future? Habitats. We talked about habitats a lot, and habitats are needed for biodiversity. We are seeing huge erosion on those habitats, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that. And that's our logo there, guys. That was one of the very first things we established 4 years ago, long before the EIP was on board, when we brought everyone around the table to try and agree. We said we want to protect, manage, and sustainably develop. And that's sustainable into the future. It's not just a short-term project. It's not about the life of the European Innovation Partnership project. This is long-term sustainability. Because if we don't have people in these areas, we're in trouble. Okay? This really doesn't like me now. It's refusing to go on to the next slide. There we go. So guys, that gives an example there of a little bit of work that we've done over the last number of years. Again, outside of the EIP, but we wanted to say that we could work together. And it is about collective management. So one of our key things that we did was we mapped all the paths. We did a path audit for the paths, the trails in the MacGillycuddy Reeks, because recreation is so huge. And one of the recommendations was that you should employ local people, upskill and train local people in path repair works. So this is what we were looking at, the before and after of what the trail looked like. So you can see that. People were walking left and right of it, plenty of water coming down, no control, no management at all. People could wherever they wanted to walk. So we trained up local landowners themselves for minimum wage, guys. That's what they were working for in all conditions. Like snow, you can imagine the conditions now that are down there. We have to work in the worst conditions. You can't manage water until you can see where water is going. So we brought them on board and we said, guys, this is local to you. It's a source of employment. They care about the land. They really care about the land. And they've such pride now afterwards to look back and see what they can accomplish, working together on their own land. So there's our little group, small little group of guys. And this is what the future will look like without it. This is what we are looking at. Rhododendron is coming in fairly fast. So we're looking at that collective approach, and we are looking to train up people to best practice to deal with the issues on the ground. And I am a great believer in people power, working together to get things done. It can happen, and it should happen. But we all have a responsibility to talk, to consider, consult, and communicate. And there we are. We don't want the farmers turning their back on it. We don't want the next generation of people turning their back on it. The time is now. And I once upon a time called the landowners dinosaurs. And I was quoted in a paper calling them dinosaurs. And I thought I'd be in big trouble with the landowners. And they said, no, Trish, we are. We're the last generation if something doesn't happen soon. Okay. So please consider becoming a friend of the MacGillycuddy Reeks. You can do it online at www.MacGillycuddyReekskerry.com. Thank you so much, guys. So our next speaker is Elaine, and Elaine's going to give you a speech. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elaine McGoff. I am the Natural Environment Officer with Taisce, and the presentation I'm giving you today is Ponds for Farm Biodiversity, and it follows on from work that I did with the Freshwater Habitats Trust. The state of Irish waters. It's a familiar story to probably most of you in the room. 44% of our river water bodies are at moderate or worse status. There's been a 3% reduction in river water quality since 2015. A 10-fold decline in pristine water since the 80s. One of the most recent statistics is that the Living Planet report found that freshwater biodiversity had fallen by over 80% since the 70s. It's affected more than any other habitat type. Things aren't looking good. Why? Well, in Ireland, agriculture is one of the main threats. We have things like land runoff, poaching, livestock trampling, and road runoff. And this washes sediments, nutrients, and pesticides into our waterways, polluting them. So what can we do about it? There's a lot of work going on in this. Some of it is based on river restoration, which is adding woody debris and flow deflectors. Bear with me, my slides have gone slightly funny. Flow deflectors back into rivers to add habitat heterogeneity. There's also work re-meandering rivers, so previously channelized rivers. There's also work on agricultural measures, like buffer zones to intercept nutrients and sediment runoff, and riparian cattle fencing to keep cattle out of the rivers. Do these work? But they do and they don't. If we look at river restoration, if you have an extremely polluted river, you can re-meander it until the cows come home. You can add as much woody debris as you like. You're not going to improve the water quality. It's still going to be polluted. Agricultural measures like buffer zones and riparian cattle fencing, they can work in certain situations. But you can have a buffer zone that's 100 metres wide. If it isn't intercepting the flow path, it's not going to be effective. So these measures can work, but there's very little evidence so far of them working at a large scale. They've been shown to work at a small scale, but what happens at the catchment level? This brings me to small water bodies. So what are they? Things like ponds, headwater streams, and ditches. These are the water bodies that are somewhat invisible under European legislation. The Water Framework Directive doesn't take these into account, but they're some of the most biodiverse water body types that we have. And very little work is done on them. Now, there is some work underway at the moment on headwater streams with the SSNet project, but ponds and ditches, they've been largely overlooked in Ireland. So I'm going to talk to you about ponds. What is so good about ponds, and why should we care? I love ponds, and I love ponds because they support 2/3 of all freshwater species, more than rivers or lakes. They're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. A lot of you probably pass them in your daily life, but they're extremely varied. You can have 10 ponds side by side and they'll all be very different to each other. So they provide lots of habitat and species diversity. Clean and healthy ponds can be quickly created. You can't say that about rivers and lakes. You can't create clean rivers and lakes. You can create clean ponds. And ponds, despite their small size, are disproportionately important for biodiversity. So where's the evidence that ponds might work on farmland? Well, the project I worked on was called the Water-Friendly Farming Project, and it was based in the UK. And it looked at 3 test catchments that were 10 kilometres squared each. They were typical agricultural clay catchments, half arable and half grass. And Patrick will probably appreciate these pictures. It's just your standard rich agricultural land. The Water-Friendly Farming Project aimed to be the first catchment scale study looking at mitigation measures for water quality. They had a control catchment. They had a catchment where they put catchment scale measures in place, such as no tillage, bonded ditches, interception ponds. And in the third catchment, they had the catchment scale measures in addition to clean water, clean pond creation. How do you create clean ponds? Something like this. You bring a digger out into the countryside, you pick your spot carefully, you take away some of the soil, make some shallow depressions, and allow it to fill with clean water, such as rainwater or groundwater. The results. I'm going to give you a very simplified version of some of the results from this project. So for the catchment scale measures like no tillage and bonded ditches, the results were really mixed. The weather was crazy. There was just a lot of noise in the data set, so you couldn't say, yes, this will work. There is no one size fits all. And that's been found in a lot of these different types of projects. It's very site specific. You really need to get down to the farm scale to figure out where these measures should go. But what this did show, clear as a bell, was the first evidence of reversing biodiversity loss at a catchment level and the return of uncommon species to the countryside. I'll just say that again, reversing biodiversity loss. When's the last time you read about something like that happening? I just seem to always be reading the bad news about biodiversity. Again, very simplified graph, just to show you. On the left-hand side, you have the control catchments, and on the right, you have the catchments with ponds. So over a 6-year period, there was no difference in the aquatic plant diversity. In the catchments with ponds, you can see there's a significant increase in the diversity of plants. The right-hand graph is the uncommon species score. There was a decrease in the control catchment, in keeping with the global trends of declining biodiversity. And really clear, I mean, this is clear as a bell, there's a huge increase in the uncommon species score in the catchments with ponds. This is a fantastic result. Where should these ponds be created? Down to logistics. They should be away from runoff. Ponds need to be rainwater fed or groundwater fed, not linked to running water. If you link them to running water, you're just going to be running the polluted water into your ponds and having polluted ponds, totally undermining your efforts. Ideally, they should be on the margins of fields, near hedgerows and earth banks, places that are out of the way of your daily farming activities, and often on land that isn't that great for agricultural production in any case. And the ideal is to have a pondscape, so maybe a group of 10 ponds to act as stepping stones and to maximize the diversity. And these ponds can be tiny, like barely bigger than puddles. They will support incredible amounts of biodiversity. The benefits of ponds. They're easy to create, and they're a quick win when they're located properly. And as well as providing habitats for aquatic organisms, small water bodies are often important for other species like bats and birds, pollinators, you name it, it needs clean water, including ourselves. And really interestingly, studies have found that connected networks of ponds are vital for mitigating climate change. They allow for movement of species north-south and east-west. They're a refuge of sorts in the landscape. So just in summary, I would say that pond creation, it may be a viable solution to the problems facing our water environment. Now, I am in no way suggesting we give up on rivers and lakes. We need to continue our efforts, very much looking at that. And I know Law Pro are doing some incredible work in that regard. But it's slow. It's slow. We have studies underway. There still is no solution. And year on year, we're losing biodiversity. 2.5% a year. We need to do something now. If we went out this very day and put a pond on every farm, we would see an increase in biodiversity within a year to improve freshwater biodiversity. So I would just end with a request and say that I'd ask you to open your eyes to our invisible ponds and see them for their true worth. They may be small, but they are teeming with life. Thank you very much. And now I'd just like to introduce Alan Lauder.
Thanks, Elaine. My name's Alan. I'm the chair of, not the Curlew project, but the Curlew task force, and that's an important distinction which we might come to. But I'm really not here to talk about the Curlew project or the Curlew task force. I'm really here to talk about farmland birds in general, in the wider sense. And I suppose I'll remind you first, on a strategic level, what does our National Biodiversity Action Plan say about biodiversity? In the vision, it says that biodiversity and ecosystems in Ireland should be conserved and restored. It should be delivering benefits essential for all sectors of society, and that Ireland contributes to efforts to halt the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystems in the EU and globally. Those are big words, and a big challenge, halting the loss of biodiversity. We've heard a lot from other speakers throughout the last day about that very thing. As an ornithologist, I'm going to talk specifically about birds and try and focus on that. And it's worth noting that in terms of farmland bird declines, we're looking at these species that are up there. And on the red list, we have barn owl, curlew, corncrake, lapwing, redshank, and so on. And right at the bottom there is the bird that's pictured, which is corn bunting, which was the last species to become extinct in Ireland. Just remember that word, extinct. We're not going to get that back easily. What is worth noting about all the others is that essentially, barring maybe yellowhammer, they're all functionally extinct in Ireland. And getting them back will be extremely difficult. And it's worth noting that those on the less high priority list, the amber list, are on their way in that direction. But why? Well, we've seen these large losses of population and range is important too, especially really since the 1970s. And we talk about corn bunting as a national extinction, but we're seeing local extinctions happen really regularly now. It's caused by a mix of things. Intensification, which you've heard a lot about. Interestingly, a move away from mixed farming towards single-use farming. So, for example, mixed farming that might have had elements of arable in it in the past, maybe for fodder or whatever, and a move towards pasture-based farming systems. Removal of non-productive habitats, i.e. a farmer seeing an area of habitat as unproductive for his use, and removing that and turning it into something else. Farms are becoming smaller, and often are becoming non-viable. You've heard a lot already about small sheep farms. So they're finding that they need to make them viable, they need to shift to alternative land uses, and that's often forestry. And sometimes, because they're non-viable, they become abandoned. All of these things are important from a conservation perspective, a biodiversity conservation perspective. And lastly, there is, I feel, a sort of historical antipathy towards conservation structures and policies and organisations within this country. And I think that needs to change, and we need to see better engagement. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen that very thing over designated sites over the years, and a real impasse when it comes to engagement. We might be getting through some of that now in more recent years, and maybe that's a sign of better things to come. I believe the main influences on farming are really four things. Farmers need to make a living, so they're going to turn to agricultural policy and especially support schemes. That's going to drive where agriculture is going. Market forces help to drive that. That need to make a living and also family ties. So they're going to use whatever's out there. So whatever's out there that they use has got to be quite good. And if we want it to deliver for birds, it's got to be well built to deliver for birds. And there's a big statement at the bottom there. I believe that reps, EOS and GLOS have yet to show any significant value at a national level for bird conservation. Some small local changes, yeah, some small local benefits, but on a national level, not. Now that graph there is from the 2018 GLOS report, GLOS evaluation report, and it illustrates where the proportion of sites that receive money for those measures that actually have the birds in question. So, for example, about 6% of sites that are paid for grey partridge conservation hold grey partridge. Corncrake, about the same. Hen harrier, just over 10%. You can see. The only one that actually seems to be delivering, possibly, although I would question it, when it comes to some of the rarer species, is wild bird cover. Yeah, farmers know how to deliver wild bird cover because it's a crop. That's good. It's a sign of what we could do if we leave some of the decision-making and solution-finding to the farmers themselves. So what are the key actions to address these? These are my opinions, but I'm sure they reflect a lot of opinions in the room. I think we need bigger ecological units to work with. So thinking about things like cooperative management in terms of agri-environment schemes across multiple farm holdings, and really providing higher incentives for that cooperative approach. So if you've got neighbours working together to deliver something that needs a landscape scale approach, maybe they should be rewarded more for that. We need better targeting. We need higher payments for better management. It's been shown time and time again, if you pay more, you get better results. We need more flexibility. Let's define the conditions that we want to produce and let the farmers find the solutions. They're the best people to find those solutions. They know their land better than anybody. And if you give them a target to hit, they can probably do it without too much intervention. We need to provide some integrated management mechanisms to provide things like non-farming operations or capital works. So, for example, things like in the relation to Curlew, you could be looking at a need for emergency predator control or wetland creation, which might be over and above just basic agri-environment schemes. And that should be more widely available. We need better conservation planning at farm level, really. We need to tailor management far better, and farm management plans might be the way forward. More money, yeah, already mentioned that. And I think ultimately we need community awareness and cultural linkages. You know, sometimes it doesn't take money, sometimes it takes a kind of relatability of the need for something to happen, and an emotive response can sometimes be required to deliver at local level. I don't want to end on a negative note, so I'm going to give you some examples of success where things have succeeded and might give us some hope. So I worked for many years with corncrakes in the west of Scotland, and we saw, in that time, we saw the population recover from about 400 calling males to about 1,500 calling males in the course of about 10 years. So it is possible to do it. The worrying thing with that, on the negative side, was that the range didn't expand in all that time. In fact, it contracted. So that's a worrying sign. I think we see some really good results from targeted things like wader prescriptions and predator control in hand through farm plan schemes, for example, on the Shannon Callows, you know, where work has been sort of Rolls-Royce level work. It's really delivered for waders, but on a local level. The Rural Stewardship Scheme, the high-level scheme in England, has shown signs for some of this really specialist farmland birds, notably stone curlew and corn bunting, and we might want to think about that for thinking about corn bunting for the future for Ireland. But the way it works there, that high-level scheme, it does provide a really excellent return for farmers when they're delivering specifically for these species. There's really good signs for corn bunting in the Outer Hebrides, a species which is fast declining in Scotland, and the re-establishment of mixed farming, away from just grassland, a grassland system, to mixed farming with arable crops coming back into macca areas, which was trialled through Life Nature and is now supported through through rural development contracts. And that's really shown some good results for corn bunting out in the Outer Hebrides. And I think on our own island, we see some signs of good results for curlew. Curlew are probably the most pressing bird conservation issue we have in Ireland right now. They will become extinct as a species, as a breeding species in this country within 10 years if we don't take the kind of action that we are recommending right now. And it's good to say that the RSPB NIA sort of joint approach in Glenwherry is showing that you can stabilise populations and you can get some recovery with the right measures. But it shows the real value of working really, really closely with farmers and putting the solutions for conservation back in the farmers' hands, which they've done very, very successfully indeed. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Barney McKay, and Patrick asked me to give a short talk from a farmer's perspective on my farm and how biodiversity has waxed and waned over my 30 plus years management of it. I farm in the Glens of Antrim. That's an out farm of ours, that volcanic plug there. And also you can just see the Scottish coast in the background there. So we're looking Ailsa Craig and Jura. And our farm is typical Glens of Antrim farm. The area doesn't suit itself to dairying. It's fairly hill orientated land, and the two traditional enterprises are suckler cows, beef and sheep. And when I returned to take over the farm from college in the early 80s, the farm wasn't very intensive, and I was left with a challenge of how was I going to support two prospective families on the land and making it a viable unit. And I followed the path that was laid out by EU support measures, and which everybody did in the 80s. I went down the production road. I reseeded and drained a lot of ground, putting perennial ryegrass in, and also changed the enterprises to more continental beef bred cattle and tripled the sheep numbers. This as a result of needing winter housing, so you have slurry and you have the associated costs of putting all that in place. And I faithfully followed this road maybe to the late 90s until I found, well, like a lot of other farmers, that it just wasn't adding up. I'd reached the maximum that I could expand the farm. The margins were still, I got less as more animals were produced, more production was in place, less output or less profit, and I was forced to go seek off farm employment, which I've been doing ever since the last 20 years actually. So that was the farm. The farm grew a lot more intensive until it reached its peak. How did biodiversity fare in that time? Like I said at the start, the biodiversity in the farm would have been quite good. We'd have a lot of the cattle were outwintered. It wasn't a very intensive system. Not much fertilisation was taking place, and a lot of species-rich grassland was present. But inevitably, I feel sometimes like I'm a vandal for doing it, but my following the economic pathway had detrimental effect on the biodiversity. as you might imagine. Lost a lot of the species-rich grassland, and a lot of the birds, we'd have ground nesting birds. I remember in the 70s, I remember being kept awake by corncrake, and we had curlews, lapwing. We lost them all. And that was, as Alan said, you need a collective approach. Because the collective approach in the area was following my model, the birds all left. Now, in our regime, we had agri-environment schemes introduced from the late 80s on, and they helped to mitigate some of the effects of the increased production and loss of habitat. We've entered the first scheme in 1988, which was a pilot scheme with the Mourns, called the ESA, Environmental Sensitive Area Scheme. And our farm has been in continuous management until the schemes ran out 2 years ago. And they, unfortunately, in the early days, were looked at as more of a hedge planting or tree planting areas that were, areas of the farm that were inaccessible. You planted a few trees, or you planted a hedge. We must have planted 3,000 metres of hedging over the period of this, 20 years. You can see there in the background, that's one was planted maybe in early 90s, and it's certainly there's no point saying it wasn't a positive, but you felt it was tinkering around the edges, and the schemes weren't emphasised enough or targeted enough to make a real difference. Farmers are, we've heard it many times, they are businessmen. They will follow whichever pathway is economic to make the farm viable. And if the schemes in place will move them towards biodiversity, they'll take up the challenge and successfully redress a lot of the negative impacts over the years. The species-rich grassland that I have left were protected by entry into the schemes, and I feel that some credit is due, even though I was maybe not well enough informed, but the policy in place has protected some valuable habitats. The schemes, just in conclusion, I would say, emphasising what we've heard from other speakers, if you have a proper system of measures that are available to improve biodiversity, such as putting ponds on the farm, which is a very good example, farmers will very quickly latch onto them if they see them viable and economically beneficial. They will adapt and they can change, and they are the ones that will make the quickest difference to the negative outcomes that we're seeing from biodiversity. That's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, speakers. If we come up here now on the panel, just the panel too, and if we could put on the Slido too, we have some time for some questions. I think I'll start the questions going, maybe directed to you, Alan. You made an interesting point. In your statement, you said reps and glass have yet to show any significant value for bird conservation at national level. Does that mean that the policy was wrong? It was poor implementation by the farming community, or in fact, it was poor ecological advice in developing the measures to begin with?
Maybe you know the answer to that already, Patrick. I suspect it's easy out. It's a combination of all three, but ultimately, I suppose it's about the policy. I remember a few years back sitting on a Agricultural and Environment Committee on behalf of the Environmental Pillar, and department actually admitted that really they were using Agri-Environment as simply a means of assisting with price support. And that hence the broad and shallow approach that we've seen in Agri-Environment schemes here. I think it's pretty fair to say, you know, you've got a wide range of options and there's no real drive to direct those options to best effect. And you can see that from that graph I showed. You know, if you're paying for, if there are 50 grey part, 50 corncrake payments going out there and only 5 of them are delivering for corncrake, or even have corncrake on their land, far less whether they're actually delivering for corncrake, then there's a problem. Should it not be a lot higher than that? Or at least should we have the hope of seeing them back on that? And there's no sign that that's the case. You know? So a combination of both at national and local level you're seeing. Occasionally you see exceptions to that rule, but they're rare.
Just Bernard, to ask you a question, you mentioned that you have species-rich grassland on your farm that you felt that an agri-environment scheme probably committed. If you take agri-environment schemes where there's a fertiliser, like the low-input permanent pasture, like, was that a product you were producing? If you were allowed under the rules to continue fertilising it, would you have continued fertilising it?
I think you have to be honest and say you would probably looked at getting the best of both worlds, where you could have, if you were allowed to fertilise it, most farmers would have continued to increase a little bit of output from that area, yeah.
And how much, like, if the product is species-rich grassland, then will farmers adapt their business accordingly for that product?
If it's economically viable, worth their while, yeah. Definitely. I mean, the perfect, in our position, we're now seeing in our area that farmers are starting to realise that the numbers, they don't have to keep the numbers of livestock because the margins are so poor. Benchmarking figures for sheep showing negative 51 for the average producer last year. Suckler cows negative in the 50s. So the animals are actually costing money to keep. And now is the perfect time, I would have thought, to introduce other alternatives. In other words, pay for public goods via what you're talking about. Yeah.
We'll maybe turn to some of the questions that that are written, that have asked. The top question is: should all farmers of the biggest issues affecting biodiversity? No, there was. Should all farmers and SACs, SBAs be working to a farm plan that takes the conservation objectives for that site into account?
The simple answer is yes. Personally, I think the simple answer is yes, but I'd go a little bit further than that, in that the SACs and SBAs should actually have a plan in themselves, and they don't. So it's and I think we've been called out on that by the recent opinion. So I think it's time that we pulled our finger out and got plans for those sites done. But yeah, alongside that, underpinning that should be farm plans.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Alan that would be the ideal, and that hopefully will be something that we'll head towards.
I think there's an awful lot of people interested in the top question, so I think I'm going to have to call you, Patricia, to talk about that. You know.
That's okay. I'm trying to read it there now. Uncontrolled burning. Okay. Well, look, guys, I suppose farmers will do what farmers think they have to do. I have met plenty of farmers now that said, "Oh, look, Trish, I'm hoping I'll be able to do a bit of a burn." I'm like, why? Why do you think it needs to be burned? Oh, well, if I don't burn it, my payments are going to stop. I'm going to be cut. That's what they are told. That's what they believe. They're not setting fire to the mountains for the fun of it. They're doing it because they're trying to bring it into agricultural use. That's why they're doing it. And I think it's very important to understand that. So what we're doing, there's some areas, and they do need to control burning. That's very controversial, I know. There's a lot of people in the room that will not agree with me. But we walked through a commons the other day, myself and the ecologist. We had difficulty walking through the land because the heather was up past my waist. Now, I know I'm not the tallest person in this room by any manner of means, but we would question then what value is in the heather when it's that high. You know, have you lost the goodness out of that heather at that stage when it's that big? So we must look at these things, but we do need to look at managing to best practice, educating. Like going back to the first question, of course farmers should be working to the conservation, but lads, I told you already, they don't know why they're designated areas in the first place. So we have to start at the very basic. And the thing about our project in MacGillycuddy Reeks is we're a pilot project. We have got 4 years to roll out a project to show learnings from our project. It's a very, very short space of time to try and get that engagement. And we will not be able to take in all landowners in the MacGillycuddy Reeks, only a small few. But I think it's important to understand that's why farmers are doing these things. They're not doing it, they're not setting out to do harm. They're trying to manage it as best as they know how.
Thank you, Patricia. And I think that the last question, organic farming seems to be a solution for nature's conservation. What is the reason that stopped farmers to conserve their farms? Why is it so underestimated? I think I'll give a personal answer to that because I'm also a farmer with a farm with quite a large percentage of semi-natural vegetation. So I went organic, my father went organic. We just couldn't make it pay. As little as money there was in suckler cows, when we went organic, getting enough fodder was a nightmare. I was going to have to do a major reseeding of the species-rich grasslands to try to get some sort of clover-based swards in. We tried it for 3 or 4 years. We were selling suckle calves. Our farm wasn't good enough to finish them. They had to go somewhere else. There was no local market, so it was purely economics. And that's probably, myself and Bernard talked about this, farmers are driven by the market. If the market plays well for organic, if the market plays well for rare breeds, farmers will adapt straight away to them. It's the same, I think, and maybe this is a point to finish on, or we'll maybe take some questions on the floor. If the market pays for species-rich grasslands and farmers have it, then they will look after it and cash in on it, you know, because we're businessmen, you know. We may have a business that's hard to relate to when you take the value of the farm and the amount we're getting out of it, you know. But at the end of the day, it has to come to a business, is what Bernard said when he had to make decisions. So we're nearly finished. We'll maybe take one question from the floor, Justin. We have one here. I'd just
like to say, can you hang on for the mic, please? I'm organic for the last 25 years, and just what you're saying, organic farming doesn't necessarily mean you have more birds or anything like that. That's a question I've been asked all the times: have our bird population increased? Not necessarily. And we're farming as commercially as possible within the constraints of organic farming, which means putting out slurry, as Bernard says, farming out manure. We've even using sludge, which is permitted. And to try and increase, as you say, to become viable, which we are viable. But I think if the government or the EU is really serious about conservation, we'll have to go in tandem with organic. Organic itself will not increase the birds or whatever, or insects. We have to do our ponds, we have to do our wildlife corridors, stuff like that. It has to be done in tandem. And I don't think just organic farming is the solution. It's good in itself. But a good organic farming is using ryegrass and stuff like that, and we've no diversity on the land, absolutely none. We have clover-rich pastures, as good as any farmer. So as I say, organic farming does work, but as I say, if we're serious, we must do something in tandem with it.
Thank you very much for them comments from a farmer working on it. We've probably time for one more question, just here, the two.
Hello, just a couple of points of information and clarification, really. Just in terms of Taisce, have you seen the work that Loch Melvin project did in relation to work on ecosystems in relation to that? And it went on quite a number of years ago. And also the agricultural catchments program, which has been going since 2006, which is very intensive monitoring on a 10-minute interval in terms of catchment level assessment of water impacts from agriculture. And just in relation to the issue of burning, I appreciate it may be suggested that it's for eligibility, but I think that underlines a kind of it's an oversimplification. The reality is the department has penalised burnt land, which was a significant issue last year, and quite an amount of land was deemed ineligible as a consequence. So I just don't want the perception that burning of upland is a requirement effectively for eligibility, which is not correct. And I don't want to appear defensive in relation to it, but I do think we have to, I suppose, be balanced in terms of the approach. And certainly in terms of the targeting then on the likes of glass, the actual requirement in terms of measures are predicated on you being in a particular location. So what had happened, if you look at historically in terms of agri-environment, you're entirely right. It was a choice of an individual to pick what was best suited. And just like water coming down a hill, people would pick the option that's least challenging for them in terms of getting return, whereas the new approach is much more targeted in terms of requiring, if you're within an area which is identified as a priority, you must pick that. You must take the appropriate steps. So if you look at it's disappointing certainly in terms of seeing the volume of birds, etc., in relation to these locations, but the Shannon Callows is a good example. Certainly, its driver was the corncrake, but you're seeing benefit for waders, etc., as a consequence of it. But like if you look at corncrake numbers there, they're quite poor, and that's the reality sometimes that we face, which I mentioned yesterday, was effort does not always translate into impact, and you just have to take that into consideration in terms of the view.
Yeah, that's a good point. Somebody pointed out, do you pay for management or do you pay for output, for birds? Yeah, it comes through. One last question, just.
Yeah, sorry guys, just to come in there again on the burning. Like definitely, it's about the knowledge gap. That's where we're trying to come at it now. We have a big role to do in education, and we have to do that across all sectors, not just with the lenders, but also with the farm advisors. So absolutely, I'm not dismissing it, and I have no part overgrazing. I didn't deal with that side of the question. Definitely, we're looking at the numbers, we're looking at the landscape, and we're looking at what are the appropriateness of the measures on the ground. So I'm not condoning it for a minute, but it's the understanding that's where we need to work on.
And projects like the EIP are a very good start at trying to address those issues,
Hi. This is a bit off topic, I suppose, but I wanted to ask, are there practical ways for food consumers to make an impact and make the market friendlier for farmers so that they might have more options?
This is interesting, and that's the thing often, because people always say local food from, say, local areas. Problem with an awful lot of the areas that have species-rich grasslands, by nature, species-rich grasslands aren't of great feeding value, and it's difficult to finish livestock, So traditionally, cattle always move from the west to the east. My suckler cows still go to County Down when I sell them for finishing on better land. So it's hard to sell a product that you're not the end user of. And most of our systems now are cattle and sheep. But there are some nice examples where maybe local butchers have tried, and Connemara lamb, Achill lamb, things like that, where it's tried to work maybe with the hill sheep. But it is quite difficult, and sustainability of the market, if you're trying to produce a product from species-rich grassland and you're going to the supermarket, they want it every week, and you're saying, I can give you a few carcasses. So that, it is always, for as long as I was an advisor for 30 years ago, it has always been mentioned, and there haven't been that many good practical examples of it yet. There probably is a role in the future in terms of beef is getting a very bad publicity in terms of greenhouse gases. And some of these areas, species-rich grassland areas, have a much lower output, and maybe there is a case for that type of feed that you can't, it needs to be grazed, it's grassland, So with that, I'll thank you all for coming. I hope we addressed some of the points and got conversation going, or discussion going. So I'd like to thank the speakers and thank the organisers. Thank you very much.